joining our webinar. Today we're doing a deep dive into integrating your SAP landscape with cloud EPM technologies such as OneStream and Business Data Cloud. So if I give a brief outline of the agenda today, first I'll give a quick introduction to our speaker, Simon Bell. Then he'll take you through some of the key drivers for integration, show you how to model your integration maturity, outline some approaches for SAP source integration, and look at best practice for your architecture, integrations, and connectivity into the SAP ecosystem. And then finally, some questions at the end. So if I just introduce Simon. Simon is a Managing Director of SAP BCS, which is now part of the Concentric Solutions Group. And he has over 30 years experience in enterprise performance management, SAP BPC implementations, and finance transformation. In 2008, he founded Opalwave Solutions, which became the leading SAP-focused consultancy before its acquisition by Sapphire Systems in 2023. Following the sale, he continued to advise and develop packaged planning and consolidation solutions, which were deployed to more than 30 Sapphire customers. Early in his career, Simon trained as an accountant, developing statistically driven planning models. He also worked at Hyperion and led the European branch of BPM Partners. He supported global organizations including IKEA, Sony PlayStation, AG Co, and Moët Hennessy in elevating performance management and achieving their business goals. Today, Simon is one of the leaders of the Concentric Solutions Group, alongside former Opalwave colleague Sham Khan, guiding businesses across Europe and the USA on the next stage of their EPM journeys. So welcome, Simon. I'll hand over the reins to you now.
Hi, thank you, Carrie, and hi, everyone. So good to see you all on a Thursday evening as winter pours in, and to talk about SAP integration with OneStream specifically, but in reality, addressing questions which are relevant regardless of the technologies we're using. But what I'll do is I'll cover off just a little bit first about what the challenges are and why we may want to have enhanced integration processes. And really, as we move into a world where AI capabilities are driving a lot of our thought processes, we start thinking about the need for quality data, the need for rapid access to large volumes of data, the need to be able to adapt what we're looking at on a reasonably regular basis. And of course, things like siloed data and fragmented capability or capacity of our integrations and our data collection processes has always been a challenge, simply because that's one of the key drivers of cost and data quality risk as we connect our systems together and manage our data. So, of course, when we think about all those data quality issues, we think about all the compliance risks, we think about meeting standards, and we think about even enabling our organizations to be agile and respond to events. The greater the automation that we have, the more capable we become in responding to and addressing those things, because we're removing a lot of those manual processes that drive that lack of agility, if you like. So those as a set of drivers are the sorts of things in a lot of organizations' minds as they think about where they need to be with regards to integrations. And of course, automation and elimination of the human in these processes as much as possible does allow us to be more accurate, faster, and more efficient in all of those processes. So we also think about, though, maybe some of the operational benefits. And of course, when we think about the operational benefits, we think about what we can do as a business user when we're working with systems. And of course, from a OneStream perspective, if we think about an example of a use case, we may have some source data that has been populated into our reporting solution. And as a business user, we may need the ability or have a desire to understand what's behind some data. So we may, at some stage, look at a data point and want to understand what's behind it, being the list of components that make up that number. But of course, those numbers may have come from an original, or obviously have come from a source, being actuals. And they may have been aggregated as they came into the system. And we can see by selecting one of these items, we can drill to a staging component. And this staging component, in this example, may be a live query back to the source system, or it may be stage data that has been aggregated and is populated within the system. So we can actually see a pre-transformation level of data, either in real time live against the source or staged within the system, if that's a preference. And of course, by having that ability to live query the source, it allows us to select an item from here and actually drill back and bring through to our reporting solution the actual documents that are backing these individual transactions. And when we think of use cases like that, what we're actually doing is we're empowering a business user to ask a question far more rapidly and get to response far more rapidly than they potentially have been able to historically. And all of that becomes possible only through an automated integration process. So if we think about that as a potential example or use case, it then drives us to consider the maturity of our integrations. And of course, when we talk about capabilities like this, it's very rarely a starting point. It's often the end of the journey. So we think about that ability of an organization to evolve its integration. And in that sense, whenever we have a reporting solution, an EPM solution or a CPM solution, be it OneStream or another solution, we will always be relying on data sourced from some kind of system. So that might be an ERP, a CRM, or other. And of course, that's going to be potentially multiple and depends very much upon the outputs that we're looking in a particular process. But at a foundational level, what we're looking at doing is being able to provide that reliable pipe from our source system to our OneStream in this case. And of course, that is often facilitated through flat file export and an import process. And of course, in OneStream particularly, we take that data into a staging table through to which we can transform the data into our reporting models, but retain that history through the stage to understand that data origination. And of course, that's a really basic capability that we would expect in all instances. But as we evolve our maturity and move towards an advanced capability, we think about the automation processes, we think about optimizing the processes and enabling the organization to deliver more value out of the process and the technologies that we've got in place. And of course, as we think about the automation, that allows us to scale to much larger integration processes, or operate across multiple entities simultaneously, etc. And of course, we also start to think about the additional functionalities and capabilities that may be delivering us. So, for example, that ability to take in large volumes of data for account reconciliations at a transactional level, or the ability to bring in much more granular people data and start modeling across our plan at again, a much more granular level, with that ability to actively source the data on demand from users at a single click rate, or simply have that operating on a scheduled basis to deliver things like the daily sales analysis, etc. And of course, the more we automate and the more we provide that capability, it allows us to optimize what we do, but also increasingly start to apply innovative capabilities. And of course, one of the more commonly deployed or being deployed capabilities that's coming out of the machine learning and AI deliveries early on is the anomaly detections and starting to understand we've got some outliers in our data. Are they errors? Are they issues that the system can start either dealing with or highlighting to us for some intervention without having to manually go through and start doing that analysis? And of course, that maturity is the additive to the value of the technologies and the capabilities that we'd expect in all scenarios. So thinking on from that, we now start to think maybe about the use specifically with SAP and best practices that we may be able to apply or that we should be applying in the integration to an SAP in an SAP scenario. But I think SAP is a big beast. It's often worth just taking a step back and validating some of the terminology. And of course, SAP themselves are regularly renaming and reframing what they're doing. Over the last few years, ECC users have been either looking at or starting on a journey to S4 HANA. And of course, the whole technology layer has evolved with the most recent incarnations of the Business Data Cloud, for example, amalgamating a number of technologies into branding portfolios. And these things we see, so if we consider ERP as a source, often one of our most common sources for our ledger data, we think back to the early 2000s with ECC, and that evolved in the early 2010s onto the ECC and on the early releases of HANA. And of course, that started off on-prem and of course evolved into where SAP has been driving many of its customers into its own cloud and into public cloud scenarios. And that ultimately led to the S4 HANA launches. And of course, then we end up with early releases and huge challenges with the amount of customization that organizations had deployed into ECC and the fact that the S4 couldn't cope with those early on. And indeed, the journey from SAP continues to evolve with that greater emphasis and direction towards the S4 HANA cloud and how SAP is now positioning that and the consequences for complex legacy ECC estates really actually starting to be unsupported in that journey in the short term as SAP continues with the evolution of that technology. But it doesn't stop there because we also end up with that whole move onto from BW to DataSphere and now with the packaging of the BDC components on the warehousing level. And of course, we could go through the different technologies, the different technology layers, the different applications, so the success factors, etc., as we look across that entire portfolio. But it is always, I think, worth just getting that starting point of terminology and an understanding, which becomes very important as we consider where we are in our journeys. But we're going to take a case specifically on the Business Data Cloud. And of course, when we think about the latest positioning from SAP of technology, the Business Data Cloud has now been around for a short while, but of course that's not a product. The Business Data Cloud is actually a bundling of products from SAP. And what we've actually got within that portfolio are a number of components. So Business Data Cloud incorporates DataSphere, and of course DataSphere itself incorporates things like the SAC layer. So what we have is a technology, a warehousing technology, or warehouse controlling technology and application content where we can manage and model our data in what now is the common terminology, some form of data fabric. We also sit that physically upon our S4 HANA cloud database, and that that applies to both the DataSphere standalone component as well as the SAC, all sitting in S4 on S4 HANA databases. And then we've got the other components, the data intelligence, which allows us to manage data and the orchestration of data, both within the SAP landscape and also outside of the SAP landscape. So again, as we consider that SAP world where we may have a snowflake warehouse coming underneath this bundling and packaging of SAP capabilities, the data intelligence layer allows us to manage that orchestration of data. And of course, the business technology platform is the underlying technical components that allow us to manage that entire SAP infrastructure. And this has all been bundled up as a marketing package into the Business Data Cloud. So, for example, our SAC is no longer available to purchase as a standalone isolated product. Of course, this move is really an SAP direction for controlling and managing the customer installations. So we have that Business Data Cloud as the latest incarnation of our data warehousing or data laking, or the terminology, our data fabric, if you like, in the SAP world. But of course, we then see that is not the only place that data is going to live. It's certainly where, from an ingestion of our business intelligence capabilities and BPM capabilities, SAP would like us to work, and certainly looking at SAP best practices, and for very good reason, you would orchestrate your data out into the reporting world through that BTP, that Business Data Cloud, or DataSphere, or Business Warehouse layer. But of course, it is possible to connect to all of the different SAP components, be that ECC or S4HANA or even the other mid-market ERPs, the BYDs, the Business Ones, the other applications, the success factors, Concurs, etc. All of these things sit at that left-hand side application layer, and they are all open to the point where we can connect directly. And what we see with this diagram here is that our OneStream component, either via our smart integration connector with its SAP component, or through standard OneStream business rules and integration rules, allows us to connect via a number of protocols to the different layers within that SAP ecosystem, whether that's an ODBC connectivity to the S4HANA for maybe a high volume data loading process, down to an API live query process to query typically smaller volumes of data or more precise data from a drill through, for example. We find that each different component of our SAP landscape is accessible through one of our technical methods there. And of course, that gets translated through the query layer into our OneStream, where it is acquired into our staging table by default. And of course, once it's in the staging table, that's where we would do within the OneStream layer the transformations that apply beyond the SAP. But we'll talk in a little bit later about what we actually are able to do in the BDC, in Business Data Cloud, where we may be acquiring our additional third-party data, where we may be acquiring data and orchestrating data from multiple sources within our SAP landscape. A little bit of a discussion as to how that happens. And of course, what OneStream is doing is working on developing its SAP connector to make that more sophisticated and have that certified across all the different layers within the SAP landscape. We do have to consider certain restrictions. So, for example, historically, we couldn't query the data in a DataSphere environment using the SAP connector and have our user security applied through a service account. Our ability to run as a user in the service account now gives us different capability, and therefore we can be much more specific and much more precise, or actually apply the security at the data level in those queries. That, of course, is a relatively recent functionality delivered by SAP that we're now able to start using through the SAP connector and still follow those best practices of deployment of correct account types in the BDC layer in that particular example. So we think then about the reasons why, or the pros and cons of our different connectivity types to different parts of this landscape, and clearly we see there's many different routes we can take to the different elements within there. And this, of course, talks to our integration approaches that we may apply. And of course, that is where we start talking about the different techniques that we may be applying to be able to access our data for different purposes. And of course, we see that we've got to the left-hand side a direct connection. So this may be our connection just directly to our S4 to load our master data and potentially transactional data, or certainly transactional data at some form of aggregated level, or potentially, depending on the volumes we're talking, right down to individual transactions. We clearly, in an EPM sense, typically do not work with transactions. We work at an aggregated level, but that aggregation can happen inside the OneStream, or it can happen as part of that extraction process on a direct connection. And certainly data volumes and purpose of use come into that. So, for example, if we're looking at an account reconciliation scenario for certain accounts, we would be typically looking at the individual transactions to enable that matching cycle. On the right-hand side, we have what is going to be the SAP best practice, and that staged approach to data. SAP does not like and does not want people to be connecting directly to the transactional systems for the obvious reasons that we're now imposing a processing load on a transactional operational system that may well result in performance challenges there, and therefore the best practice is to stage that data into a BW or the data sphere to allow us to, in SAP best practice sense, work with data that is in the right place and has been curated and governed in the right ways for our reporting processes. But of course, when we think about that business example of the drill through, we can't do that back to a stage unless that stage has had all of that data loaded into it, and that's typically not going to be a rational expectation. We wouldn't typically expect all the transactions and all the backing documentations of transactions to be taken from ERP into the BW. And therefore we think about that hybrid approach, and this is where we think about what's the purpose of the interaction. So it may be the API-based access to the very specific transactional data that we're looking to query based on an interpretation of staged data that has been pre-aggregated. And of course, this is that kind of evolved scenario that we typically see, that we're now starting to be much more sophisticated with our data needs and our data processes. So thinking across those scenarios, we may often start with a simple direct or staged integration, then evolve into a hybrid scenario where we're being very much more precise about the purpose of data for a particular process and that ability to access it. And that's where we start to consider what is the most appropriate means of acquiring data in a very specific scenario. So what I think I'd like to do next is just run through a process of how do we actually go about provisioning that data through the BDC, for example. And of course, SAP every module, we could be acquiring our data through a delivered data source directly out of S4, but we'll talk in this case about a BDC connection. So if we think about what the BDC is, the Business Data Cloud, it's the component now, or it is the packaging of components where SAP is allowing us to orchestrate our data. It's allowing us to bring data across, not just from SAP applications, but also enrich our data from third-party sources as well. And we'll see certainly an evolved and going forward more and more in SAP or organizations, deployment of BDC. And of course, already a lot of the components of that deployed in organizations today. We do have some consciousness there when we're looking at things. So, for example, with our data sphere being a warehousing component and potentially SAC, the SAP Analytics Cloud deployed, which is great at ingesting data, but not so great at exporting it and providing that data to subsequent processes. We do see, depending on where and how we've used that overall infrastructure, a different approach going to be applied in different places. But if we look at that BDC overall structure, we've got the top layer there where we've got our data. Basically, it's the ability to interact with our data, our analytic applications, be they SAP applications or third-party applications such as OneStream or other EPM tools. We look at the business data layer, the data fabric layer in there, where we've got the physical storage and the processing of the data within the SAP landscape. And of course, at the bottom there, the physical databases themselves. And they are being fed by that combination of SAP and non-SAP applications as appropriate for our business use case. So if we think about that as the component in this example that we're going to connect to, what is it that we have to actually do to access that? Well, if we think about or starting off in the BDC cockpit, before we have access to anything, we simply have that menu of data products that we can install that are delivered by SAP. And there are many of those things. So we can consume data from S/4HANA Cloud, for example, with a predefined data product that we simply connect to, and using the BDC Foundation Services, also known as the Business Technology Platform, activate that, which converts it into a ready-to-use data product. And when we talk about a ready-to-use data product, that means now it's something that the Business Data Cloud can expose and use for the purposes of our business users. We then take that next step. Our data has been exposed into a data product, and that now becomes available in the data sphere. So we physically brought that into our modeling environment, where we can manipulate it, we can enrich it. We may be activating some logic processes on there, we may be activating some enrichment process on there to create a more sophisticated, potentially source component of data. But this now gives us a completed data product, and all of these things to get from that start point to this point are menu driven and simply process virtually through single clicks. Now, we do have that ability to customize those things. So, for example, if there isn't a prepackaged data product that includes all of the data that has been packaged by SAP, All of those things are configurable and extensible, and therefore, if the data exists inside of SAP or the data exists in a third-party solution that we want to bring into that data business data cloud environment, we can do that. Obviously, that's a little bit more technical, involves coding depending on what that source is and what that data point is. But the pre-packaged SAP delivered components allow us to get a very, very rapid head start that is simply menu-driven and zero code. And of course, once we've got now that delivered data package, we're able to use that in our OneStream deployment by connecting it through, in this example, a smart integration connector, which sits with its components, querying directly against that BDC environment with that data product exposed and therefore accessible. And of course, on the left-hand side, we see our S4 deployment capabilities there, curated and controlled inside our SAP environment with a simple dashboard, for example, that allows us to identify the URL string for our SAP instance, our security, so our passwords, etc., that we're logging on with, and using the dashboard and query helpers within the OneStream system that allows that to be either automated or executed on demand through the query process, and the SIC there interpreting that and managing the comms between the OneStream and the BTC environment, again in a completely using SIC there, no code process. And of course, what this means is that we're able to very rapidly deploy integrations between our SAP, both across multiple endpoints or sources within that SAP landscape, and our OneStream final target destination. And of course, one thing there that we have is that bi-directional data capability, and therefore, if we do that onward processing in our OneStream, we are also able to push that concluded data back into our BDC or back into our BW, so that we're able to continue and use that data in either the processes or expose it to our additional reporting that may be set in our SAP landscape there as well. In brief summary, there we see an example of our HANA or a HANA integration settings dashboard with the URLs, the authentication concepts and components, manageable on that dashboard type of view. But what we see there is we are not restricted by any of the products. We can connect to any of the SAP products, and of course, that may be for different purposes at different times, but of course the BDC, by taking that orchestration activity inside SAP, gives us an option to manage data there, if that's our governance process. Of course, we can, manage that data directly inside OneStream, and OneStream obviously provides all those data enrichment capabilities, supplementary data capabilities that allow us to port that data that may have come from SAP that maybe wasn't available in our SAP landscape. And of course, the SIC, the OneStream Smart Integration Connector, has been developed to facilitate these processes in a no-code environment, allowing ourselves to be more rapidly deployed, and as OneStream certify the connector components against the SAP sources, allow you to have that extended and improved process evolved. Again, just aligning that with our SAP landscape, we see that we bring that OneStream product into that analytics layer within our BDC landscape after that integration process. So I think that's the end of the formal process. So I think we can open that up to any questions if there've been any, Carrie.
Lovely. Thank you, Simon. That was very informative. First question is, we have ECC and S/4HANA. Can we integrate both together?
Yes, yeah. I mean, so you can. I think that's meaning can you integrate them simultaneously? You can have integrations from ECC and S4 at the same time. It's quite common that organisations have got potentially multiple instances. We've worked with organisations with, for example, multiple instances of S4 and multiple instances of ECC in different parts of their organization, and each of these potentially with its own chart of accounts as well, for example, being simultaneously integrated on a lights out process. Of course, you think about the journey, some of those more sophisticated capabilities, and you'd probably start asking question for the what's the organization's state of migration, for example, between ECC and S4, because clearly if the ECC's got a limited life, you might want to be considering the investment in the S4 and not necessarily in the ECC, because you're going to acquire that capability as the entities migrate or the countries migrate and things like that. But you just got to think about that rationale for the deployment. Of course, some of the latest considerations coming out of SAP are that for more sophisticated ECC users, SAP is no longer pushing that migration, quite simply because it's too difficult, and S4 is not yet supporting, or certainly S4 HANA Cloud is not supporting the capabilities that people have deployed in their ECC legacy landscapes. And therefore, we're looking at an extended maintenance, quite significantly extended maintenance timeline on the ECC. And of course, that potentially changes the dynamic of that conversation.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Second question, does OneStream support real-time reporting from SAP data sources?
Not real time, but certainly near real time. So if we think about our process, we're loading data from our SAP to OneStream. Clearly, if we're talking about a financial close, that might be monthly. If we're talking about sales analytics, it may be daily. So the purpose of the data is going to dictate the timeline that we work. We typically would not be working on for example, a delta load being refreshed on a high frequency basis. But what we may be doing is enabling a live drill through which queries the source, the SAP source, in real time, and therefore whatever is in the source at the query point will be what we return. But again, the nature of what we do probably dictates it's more of it's more of a periodic snapshot reporting capability as opposed to not real time and even low frequency of deployments that we'd consider even near real time. Technically, we can support various things, but it's about the practicalities of what we're actually reporting and why.
Okay, great. Thank you. Third question, what's a best practice for managing master data consistency between SAP and OneStream?
Okay, well, I mean, clearly, master data is super important because that's how we understand what our data means. And we often find that because we are living in a consolidated, let's call it consolidated with a small c basis in our OneStream, we're talking about aggregating data from multiple sources. So if our sources have different master data because we are loading data from different instances with different charts of accounts, different product codes, groups, etc., we may be managing our master data more predominantly in the OneStream itself. However, if we're thinking about a scenario where we've got a unified source whether that be a single instance with all the master data managed within that single instance of the source, or because we've got a master data management tool allowing us to orchestrate and control the master data across our different sources. We're able to acquire the master data either from that master data management process, or, if we look at the BDC scenario, for example, BDC will automatically acquire the master data from the sources within the SAP itself and maintain that integrity of structure and hierarchy and coding, etc. And we can acquire directly that master data from the BDC, or we can be acquiring the master data directly from the S4 or the success factors or other components as required. So the OneStream is capable of originating its master data directly from the SAP or directly from a master data management process in those senses, and therefore our best practice in that scenario is, if we've got those tools in place, we should be accessing them. But we have to be conscious, of course, that certain elements of master data would be existent within our OneStream and maybe not existent within our other sources, and those pieces have a process and a governance associated with them, but that's not necessarily going to be synchronized or automated from the SAP itself. That may well be something that we are building things within the OneStream and that governed process in the OneStream workflow as well. But of course, it depends on that origination of where that governance process is, or where that master data management tool is, or whether we are able for business purposes to rely on that SAP specific source for the master data control.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question from the audience. Other than installing the OneStream marketplace solution at the OneStream side, is there any additional setup required to be done in SAP BW side to support the OneStream integration?
There certainly needs to be a service account that allows us to connect with and access, but and of course that's the technical requirement. But fundamentally, the work within the BW is all around curating the data that's going to be required, and of course, BW doesn't necessarily have quite the same set of automated tools as the BDC. So yes, the key work there in the BW is about deploying the right data product and the right data content, so that we can connect. But once we connect, again using the OneStream connector, we're able to interpret that data structure that has been deployed in the BW. Now, we do have options there. So, for example, any transformations that we need to do, which we want to do, for example, beyond the BW, we can do further in OneStream, but we're also equally at liberty to do all of the transformations within the BW and provide the OneStream with a finished data product that is simply loaded with no transformation necessary. So the answer to that question really is about the data and anything that needs to happen to the data. Other than that, there's not a particularly significant overhead in configuration of the technical connectivity, other than granting the access on the SAP side.
Excellent, thank you. So that's all the questions we have. So I think we can bring this session to a close now. Thank you, Simon, for sharing your insights, and thank you to everyone else for joining us today. We hope you found the content useful. If you have any further questions for Simon, do feel free to reach out to him directly on LinkedIn. As always, you can watch any of our previous webinar recordings on our website. So thank you again for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.